The sun was setting low that evening when the family gathered at the old lawyer's office. The building itself looked like something from another time. Dark wooden walls, tall shelves filled with dusty books, and a long table in the middle of the room where everyone was meant to sit. It was quiet at first. Only the ticking of the old clock on the wall could be heard. But the tension in the air was heavy, almost too heavy to ignore. Everyone had come for the same reason, to hear the reading of the will. Among the people who arrived was a woman who stood out, not because of wealth or fancy clothes, but because she was different from the rest. She was a simple black woman, dressed neatly but plainly in a modest dress that had clearly been worn more than once. Her shoes were polished but not new. She walked softly, carrying herself with quiet dignity, but the way others looked at her made it clear that she was not fully welcome. Some raised their eyebrows. Some exchanged whispers. A few even smirked as if wondering why she was there at all. She did not respond to their stares. Instead, she found a chair near the end of the long table and folded her hands in her lap. She kept her eyes down, choosing not to meet their judgmental looks. To anyone else, it might have seemed like weakness. To her, it was strength. She had learned long ago that silence could speak louder than any words. The other relatives, dressed in fine clothes and expensive jewelry, took their seats as though they owned the room. Their voices were louder, filled with impatience and expectation. They spoke of houses, land, money, and everything they believed they were about to gain. None of them even glanced her way, except to throw the occasional sharp look of curiosity or disdain. She was an outsider in their eyes, someone who did not deserve to be there, someone unworthy of mention. The lawyer, an older man with silver hair and a calm voice, shuffled through the papers on his desk. He cleared his throat, signaling that the reading would soon begin. The room grew quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that buzzed with hidden thoughts. Some were already dreaming of the wealth they believed would fall into their hands. Others were impatient, tapping their feet, eager for their names to be called. And still she sat quietly, her expression unreadable. Outside, the world went on as normal. Cars passed by on the street. The faint sound of children playing drifted in from a nearby yard, and the evening breeze rattled the window. But inside the room, time felt frozen. Every second stretched long, as though the entire world was waiting with them for the words that would be read. The simple woman took a deep breath. She remembered the one who had passed away, the person whose will was about to be read. She remembered kindness, warmth, and the many moments of humanity that others seemed to forget. She had not come for money nor for riches. She had come because she had loved and been loved in return. That to her was reason enough to sit at the table, no matter how the others looked at her. But her presence continued to stir discomfort among the relatives. A woman in pearls leaned over to her husband and whispered, not quietly enough, "Why is she even here?" He shrugged but gave a short laugh, one that was filled with cruelty. Another relative, a young man in a sharp suit, smirked and muttered under his breath, probably hoping for scraps. The words carried across the room like poison, and though she heard them, she did not lift her head. The lawyer finally spoke. His voice was steady, carrying authority, and instantly the room obeyed his silence. "We are here today to read the last will and testament," he began. His words rolled on, but for many in the room it was difficult to listen. Their minds were on themselves, their desires, their expectations. They wanted names, property, money. Their eyes gleamed with greed. She sat still, listening carefully, her heart calm. She had no expectations, no grand dreams of fortune. She had only come to honor the memory of someone who had once seen her as equal, as human when so many others did not. And so the stage was set. In that old wooden office, with its shelves of forgotten books and its walls echoing with greed, a story was about to unfold. One woman sat in silence, underestimated and judged, while around her a family prepared to fight over what they believed belonged to them. None of them yet knew that before the night was over, everything they thought they knew would be turned upside down. The lawyer's voice had only just started to fill the room when the whispers grew louder. It began with small things, careless words dropped into the silence, the kind of remarks that were meant to sting but disguised as casual conversation. One woman, dressed in a fur coat far too heavy for the warm room, leaned back in her chair and said loudly to the man beside her, "Some people really don't understand when they're not wanted." Her eyes flicked, just for a second, toward the simple black woman sitting at the end of the table. The man gave a quiet chuckle, as though it were some private joke meant for everyone except her. Another voice chimed in from across the table. "I wonder if she even knew the deceased properly," said a man with a sharp jaw and an expensive watch. "Maybe she's here because she heard there'd be money involved. You know how some people are." His words carried easily through the air, cutting sharper than any knife. A few others smirked. Some even nodded as though they agreed without needing to say it out loud. The woman who sat quietly at the end of the table kept her head down. Her fingers touched the fabric of her dress, folding and unfolding it, but she did not speak. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence was the strongest answer. But that did not mean she did not feel their words. Each one pressed down on her heart like a weight, a reminder that to them, she did not belong. The lawyer, perhaps aware of the growing tension, continued reading as though he hadn't heard. His voice carried on about dates, documents, and legal terms. But the family was restless. They whispered louder, sometimes not even bothering to whisper at all. The insults grew bolder, crueler, disguised in the thin veil of laughter. "She should be grateful just to sit in this room," someone muttered. "Doesn't even look like she could afford the bus ride here," another sneered. And then came the laughter, sharp, hollow, and echoing off the wooden walls of the office. It wasn't the laughter of joy. It was the laughter of mockery, of people convinced of their own importance. Still, she remained still. Her eyes stayed fixed on the table, though her chest rose and fell with steady breaths. In her silence there was dignity. She would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She had promised herself she would not, but the cruelty did not end. A younger woman, perhaps emboldened by the others, leaned forward and spoke directly this time. "Do you even know why you're here?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Or did you just wander in because you thought there might be free food?" The table erupted in laughter again. Even the lawyer paused, frowning slightly before adjusting his glasses and returning to his papers. For a moment, the simple woman's eyes lifted. She looked at the young woman who had spoken, and though her face showed no anger, her gaze was steady. It was a look that carried years of pain, strength, and survival. It silenced the laughter for only a second, but that second was enough. Then she lowered her eyes once more, choosing peace over anger. The others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, though none of them admitted it. It was easier to hide behind laughter than to face the truth of their cruelty. Yet deep down, some of them already felt uneasy. There was something in her calmness, something in the way she refused to break, that unsettled them more than any argument could have. Outside, the sky had grown darker, the last rays of sunlight fading beyond the windows. The air in the room seemed heavier now, as though the walls themselves were listening. Every insult hung there, refusing to disappear. And though she did not reply, every cruel word said more about them than it ever could about her. The lawyer finally stopped reading. He glanced up at the group, his sharp eyes settling on the noisy whispers, the cruel laughter. "If we could proceed with respect," he said firmly, "this is a serious matter." His voice was calm, but the warning in it was clear. The room grew quieter, though smirks and mocking smiles still lingered on several faces. The woman at the end of the table exhaled slowly. She could feel her heart beating, not from fear, but from the pressure of sitting in a place where she was unwanted. She thought of the one who had passed away, the reason she was here. She remembered kindness and warmth, and she reminded herself that she was not here for them nor for their approval. She was here for truth. What none of them knew, what none of them could even imagine, was that the truth waiting inside that will would change everything. The ones who insulted, who mocked, who laughed, were about to discover that the person they despised most in this room was the very person who would hold everything they wanted. The night had only just begun, and already the air was thick with arrogance, cruelty, and greed. But hidden beneath it all was a storm waiting to break. A storm that would wipe the smug smiles off their faces and leave them staring in shock at the quiet woman they had tried so hard to tear down. The laughter in the room eventually faded, but the sting of it remained in the air like smoke after a fire. The simple black woman sat at the end of the table, her hands folded gently in her lap. She did not rise to defend herself. She did not throw back the insults or ask why she was being mocked. Instead, she sat in silence, her posture straight, her face calm, her presence steady. Her silence was not weakness. It was a kind of power most of them could never understand. In a room full of raised voices and sharp words, her quietness spoke louder than anything. She had learned through a lifetime of trials that sometimes the strongest thing you could do was refuse to let others pull you into their anger. The others, however, mistook her calmness for shame. They leaned toward each other, whispering again, thinking she had accepted their words as truth. "See," one of them muttered. "She has nothing to say. She knows she doesn't belong here." Another chuckled softly, confident in their own importance. But deep inside, the woman held memories that no one at that table could take away. She remembered late evenings spent with the one who had passed away, talking softly by the fire. She remembered the small acts of kindness that had been shown to her, kindness no one else in that room had ever cared to give. She was not there to fight for wealth. She was there because of love, respect, and gratitude. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the noise of the room fade. She thought of those moments, and it gave her strength. When she opened her eyes again, she did not look at those who mocked her. Instead, she looked at the lawyer, listening carefully as he read. She wanted to hear every word, not because she expected anything, but because it was the final chapter of someone's life she had cared about. Her dignity began to unsettle the others. Some shifted in their seats, restless. There was something in her silence they could not understand. Why did she not fight back? Why did she not defend herself? To them, dignity looked strange, almost unnatural, because they had never needed to practice it. They lived lives where loudness and arrogance were mistaken for strength. One woman in pearls tried again, her voice sharp. "You sit there so quiet, but silence won't change anything. You're only here to watch the rest of us inherit what truly belongs to us." She expected the woman at the end of the table to break, to argue, to finally show some kind of anger, but there was nothing. Only a calm glance in her direction, steady, almost gentle, before the woman lowered her eyes again. That glance, though brief, was powerful. It carried no anger, no hate, just a reminder that she was not as weak as they believed. It unsettled the woman in pearls so much that she quickly looked away, her cheeks coloring slightly. The lawyer, noticing the tension but saying nothing, continued with his careful reading of the will. His voice echoed in the room, steady against the storm of greed and cruelty swirling around the table. He spoke of dates, properties, and instructions, but most of the relatives barely listened. They were too busy watching one another, measuring greed against greed, waiting for their names to be called. All the while, the simple woman sat silently, her back straight, her chin slightly lifted. She was not proud, not arrogant, but she carried herself with a quiet strength. In her stillness there was dignity. In her patience there was power. She was like a stone in the river, battered by rushing water but never moving, never breaking. The relatives grew more restless as her calmness stretched on. It was easier to mock someone who shouted back. It was easier to insult someone who crumbled. But her silence gave them nothing to hold on to. It was like throwing stones into the sea. Each insult sank into her calmness and disappeared. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. The greedy relatives still thought they were in control, still believed they were moments away from riches, but deep down an uneasiness had begun to creep in. The silence of the woman at the end of the table had become a mirror, reflecting their ugliness back at them. Some ignored it. Others felt it, though they would never admit it. She knew none of this. She was not playing games or trying to teach lessons. She was simply being herself, a woman who had faced enough hardship to know that anger solved nothing. That dignity lasted longer than any insult, and so she sat, listening carefully, waiting for the words that would decide the future. Around her, the relatives grew more impatient, more bitter, more desperate. They believed her silence was useless. They could not see that it was the strongest thing in the room. In the stillness of her heart, she whispered a small prayer of thanks for the one she had lost, for the chance to sit in that room at all, for the strength to keep her head held high. She did not know what the will would say. She did not expect anything. But whatever came, she was ready. What she could not know was that her silence, her calmness, her quiet dignity, would soon stand in sharp contrast to the chaos that was about to erupt. Because the words the lawyer was about to read next would shatter every assumption, every cruel smile, and every whispered insult in that room. And when the truth was revealed, the very people who mocked her silence would be left speechless themselves. The air inside the lawyer's office felt heavier than before. The laughter had quieted, though smirks still lingered on several faces. The greedy relatives leaned forward, their eyes sharp and expectant. For them, this was the moment they had been waiting for. The insults, the whispers, the mockery. All of it was just noise to pass the time until the real reason they were there unfolded. The will, the lawyer, an older man with silver hair and glasses that kept sliding down his nose, adjusted the thick stack of papers in front of him. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, as though he wanted every person in that room to realize the seriousness of what was about to be said. His voice, calm but steady, finally cut through the restless silence. "This," he began, "is the last will and testament of the late Mr. Edward Langley." The name carried through the room, stirring murmurs. Some nodded as though they expected the wealth of such a man to fall neatly into their hands. Others smirked, certain they knew what was coming. They believed they were the rightful heirs, the ones who had the blood, the names, the history. The simple black woman at the end of the table lifted her head slightly, her eyes fixed on the lawyer. She breathed deeply. For her, the name did not mean money or property. It meant kindness, memories, humanity. The sound of it carried weight in her heart, heavier than all the gold the others were waiting for. The lawyer cleared his throat and continued. "Mr. Langley has left behind instructions regarding the distribution of his estate, his properties, and his assets." The room leaned in. Earrings glistened, pens tapped against polished wood, and greedy eyes sparkled with hunger. They were ready to claim their shares. They were ready to hear their names, but the lawyer did not rush. He unfolded the first page, his glasses catching the dim light as he read. "To my nephew Charles." A man in a sharp gray suit straightened proudly, already smiling. Yes, of course," he whispered to himself. "I leave the family car collection on the condition that it is maintained with care." The man smiled wider, satisfied. A murmur of approval swept the room. "It had begun. To my sister Margaret," the lawyer went on, "I leave the lake house, along with all its belongings." An older woman in pearls clutched her husband's arm, her lips curling into a smile of triumph. "I knew it," she muttered, barely able to contain her glee. One by one, the lawyer read smaller gifts, possessions, tokens. A watch here, a painting there. Items that carried meaning but not the bulk of wealth. The family members nodded, smirked, whispered. Each time a name was called, the others grew more impatient, more envious, more restless. And still, the woman at the end of the table sat quietly. Her name had not been spoken. She did not expect it to be. To her, just being there was enough. To sit in the same room where his last words were being honored felt like a gift already. But then the lawyer paused. He placed the papers down, folded his hands, and looked over the rim of his glasses at the group. The silence was sharp, almost painful. Even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder. "And now," the lawyer said slowly, "for the matter of the main estate." The words sent a ripple through the room. Back straightened, eyes widened. This was it. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. The wealth, the houses, the money, the legacy. Each person in that room imagined it in their own hands. They saw themselves as the true heir, the rightful one. Some even glanced toward the simple woman at the end of the table, smirking. They expected her to shrink when the truth came out, when she was left with nothing. They imagined her walking out quietly while the rest of them celebrated their fortune. But she did not shrink. She sat with her back straight, her eyes steady on the lawyer. She was not waiting for wealth. She was waiting for closure. The lawyer's eyes swept across the room. He could feel the hunger, the greed, the impatience radiating from every face. His voice remained calm, but there was a heaviness to it, as though he knew the storm that was about to come. "Mr. Langley," he said, "chose to leave the entirety of his remaining estate, houses, lands, investments, and wealth to one person." Gasps echoed through the room. Entirety, the whole estate? Not divided? Not shared? The family members glanced at one another, their faces tight with shock and disbelief. Surely it would be one of them. Surely it would fall to the oldest son, the closest relative, the one with the highest claim. The lawyer lifted the final page of the will. His voice grew firmer. He wished for this to be read exactly as written. The room leaned forward as one, hearts pounding, breaths shallow. The silence stretched so long it felt as if the world outside had stopped moving. And then, with words as steady as stone, the lawyer read the name. The name that would shatter their pride. The name that would silence their laughter. The name that would change everything in that room. It was not theirs. It was hers. The woman at the end of the table. The one they had mocked. The one they had humiliated. The one they had treated as nothing. Was about to be revealed as the heir of everything. The lawyer's lips parted, and for a moment it felt as if the entire room held its breath. The greedy relatives leaned so far forward that their chairs creaked against the wooden floor. Their eyes glittered, their fingers tapped nervously on the table, and in their minds they were already celebrating. They could see themselves walking out with wealth, with titles, with everything they believed they deserved. But then the lawyer spoke. His voice was calm, steady, but the words he read struck the room like thunder. I leave the remainder of my estate, my houses, my land, my businesses, and all of my wealth to... He paused, his eyes moving across the table. Miss Eleanor Hayes. The silence that followed was like a heavy curtain falling over the room. Every face froze, mouths half open, eyes wide in disbelief. The air seemed to vanish, leaving only shock behind. And at the far end of the table, the simple black woman, Eleanor, sat still, her hands trembling ever so slightly in her lap. At first she thought she had misheard. Her name, could it really have been her name? She stared at the lawyer, her lips parted, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The sound of her name spoken with such finality seemed unreal. Then the whispers began. What did he just say? He said her name. No, that must be a mistake. Read it again. Read it again. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and repeated firmly. Mr. Edward Langley has named Miss Eleanor Hayes as the sole heir to his estate. Chaos erupted. Chairs scraped against the floor. Hands slammed on the table. Voices rose all at once, overlapping in anger, disbelief, and fury. This is ridiculous, shouted one man, his face red with rage. She's not even family, cried another, her pearl necklace rattling as she shook her head violently. There's no way he would do this, no way. The lawyer held up his hand, trying to calm the room. I assure you, he said, this is the valid, signed, and witnessed will of Mr. Langley. His instructions are clear. But the family would not be calmed. They argued, shouted, pointed fingers. Some even turned on Eleanor directly, their eyes burning with hatred. You tricked him, one woman spat. You must have forced him. What lies did you tell him? Another accused. Their words, sharp and poisonous, filled the room like smoke. Eleanor sat frozen in her chair. She could feel her heartbeat in her ears, pounding so hard she thought the others might hear it. Her throat was dry, her hands cold. She had not come expecting riches. She had not dreamed of wealth or power. And now, in front of the people who had mocked and humiliated her, she was being told that everything was hers. It was overwhelming, terrifying. And yet, beneath the storm of emotions, there was a flicker of something else. Gratitude. She thought of Edward Langley, of his kindness, his fairness, the way he had treated her not as less, but as equal. He had seen her worth when no one else had. And in his final act, he had chosen to honor that. The others could not accept it. A man in a gray suit stood up, his fists clenched. I will contest this, he growled. This will is a fraud. Others shouted their agreement, their voices clashing with one another until it became a roar of anger and greed. But the lawyer's voice cut through again, sharp and commanding. You may contest it if you wish, he said firmly, but until then this will stand. Miss Hayes is the legal heir. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, not of pride, not of arrogance, but of deep, aching gratitude. She pressed her hands together tightly, whispering a silent thank you. The room around her shook with fury, but she remained seated, calm and still, her heart quietly breaking and healing all at once. She had been mocked, insulted, treated as nothing. And now, in one single moment, the truth had turned everything upside down. The people who had laughed at her now glared with envy. The people who had dismissed her now burned with anger. It was not revenge she felt. It was not triumph. It was something deeper, something purer. The weight of dignity, the gift of being seen, the validation of a life lived in patience and strength. Outside the office, the night deepened. The streets were quiet, the stars slowly appearing in the dark sky. But inside, the storm raged on. Arguments clashed, voices rose, accusations flew. And through it all, Eleanor sat in silence, the very same silence they had once mocked. Only now that silence was unshakable. That silence carried the weight of truth. The will had been read. The decision was final. And no matter how much they screamed, no matter how much they protested, the fact remained. The woman they had humiliated, the woman they had treated as less than nothing, was now the one who held everything. And for the first time that night, Eleanor slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, soft yet steady, met theirs. She said nothing, but in that quiet gaze was a message louder than any words. Respect cannot be stolen and dignity cannot be destroyed. The revelation was complete. The world inside that room had shifted forever. The room exploded after the revelation. For a few seconds there had been silence, the kind that comes when people are too shocked to speak. But then, like a dam breaking, all the anger and disbelief poured out at once. The lawyer tried to keep order, but his calm voice was no match for the storm of greed and fury that rose inside those four walls. "You cannot be serious," shouted Charles, the man in the gray suit who had been so sure of his inheritance. His face turned red as he slammed his hand on the table. "I am his blood. I am family, and you expect me to believe that he left it all to her?" His finger jabbed in Eleanor's direction like an accusation. Others quickly joined in. "This is madness," cried Margaret, clutching at her pearls as if she were the true victim. "I raised him when he was younger. I was there before she ever appeared in his life. And this is how he repays me?" Another relative, younger and sharper, leaned forward with venom in his voice. "She must have manipulated him. There's no other explanation. Look at her. She doesn't deserve a penny." The insults came like arrows, faster and sharper than before. Words like undeserving, fraud, thief filled the air. The same people who had laughed at her earlier now stared at her with rage. Their greed burned into every expression. The woman they once thought of as nothing had suddenly become their enemy. The obstacle between them and the fortune they had already imagined as their own. Eleanor sat still, her back straight, her hands folded. Her heart raced inside her chest, but her face remained calm. She could hear every word, every accusation, but she would not lower herself to their anger. Their fury did not erase the truth. The lawyer raised his hand, his voice firm. "I must remind you all that Mr. Langley's will is legally binding. He was of sound mind when he wrote it, and it has been properly witnessed. Your anger does not change his wishes." But the family would not listen. "We will contest it," shouted one. "We'll drag this to court," another threatened. They spoke over one another, a rising tide of rage and envy. For people who had spent their whole lives chasing wealth, the thought of losing it all to the quiet woman at the end of the table was unbearable. Some looked at Eleanor with disgust, others with hatred, but behind all of it was fear. Fear that they had been seen for what they truly were. For years they had believed they were entitled to everything, and in a single moment that illusion had been shattered. One woman broke down into tears, not of sadness but of frustration. "How could he do this?" she cried. "How could he leave us with nothing? We are his family." The lawyer adjusted his glasses and spoke calmly. Mr. Langley was clear in his reasons. He wrote that Miss Hayes showed him compassion, loyalty, and honesty during his final years, qualities that he valued above all else. That is why he chose her. Those words cut deeper than any legal statement. Compassion, loyalty, honesty. They were qualities the others had never shown him. And now in death, Edward Langley had made his judgment not with words but with his final act. The family's rage deepened. They shouted louder, their protests filling the air until it felt as if the walls themselves were shaking. But no matter how loud they became, the truth did not change. The will had been read. The decision was final. Through it all, Eleanor remained silent. She felt the heat of their anger, the weight of their stares, but she did not break. She thought of Edward, of his kindness, of the way he had once told her, "Dignity will carry you further than anger ever will." Those words echoed in her heart now, steadying her against the storm, slowly. She lifted her eyes and looked around the room. Not with arrogance, not with revenge, but with calmness. Her gaze met theirs one by one. And though she did not speak, her silence carried a message. She did not need to defend herself. The truth defended her already. The family, for all their shouting, could not bear that look. One by one, their voices faltered, their rage twisting into something else, shame. They would never admit it, not out loud, but in the pit of their hearts they knew. They had mocked her, insulted her, laughed at her. And in the end, she had been the one chosen. Not them. The lawyer finally stood. "This meeting is concluded," he said firmly, gathering the papers. If you wish to contest, you may do so legally. Otherwise, Mr. Langley's wishes stand. The relatives grumbled, some still shouting, some storming toward the door, their anger echoing down the hallway. Their footsteps faded, but their bitterness hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Eleanor remained seated for a moment longer, her hands pressed together tightly. She had not asked for this. She had not dreamed of wealth or power. And yet here she was, holding the legacy of a man who had seen her worth when no one else would. As she stood, her chair scraping softly against the wooden floor, she felt dozens of eyes still burning into her back. But she did not falter. With each step toward the door, her dignity grew stronger. She had endured their insults in silence, and now she carried the weight of their envy with the same quiet strength. They had mocked her silence. Now they were silenced by the truth. When the shouting finally faded and the last of the furious relatives stormed out of the lawyer's office, the room grew strangely still. The air no longer vibrated with insults or accusations. Instead, there was only silence, thick, heavy, and almost peaceful. For the first time that evening, Eleanor could breathe without the sting of cruel words around her. She sat for a moment longer, her hands resting gently on the table, as though she needed time to understand the weight of what had just happened. She had come here expecting nothing but closure, perhaps even more humiliation. Yet she was leaving with everything: the wealth, the properties, the legacy of Edward Langley. It didn't feel real. Her heart swelled, not with pride, but with gratitude. Tears filled her eyes, and though she tried to blink them back, they slipped quietly down her cheeks. She quickly wiped them away, embarrassed to show weakness, but the truth was that they were not tears of weakness at all. They were tears of love, of memory, of the simple fact that someone had believed in her enough to entrust her with their life's work. The lawyer watched her silently for a moment. He had seen many will readings in his long career, rooms filled with greed, fights that tore families apart, moments of despair. But rarely had he seen dignity like this. Rarely had he seen someone receive so much and carry it with such humility. "Miss Hayes," he said softly, adjusting his glasses, "Mr. Langley held you in the highest regard. He believed you deserved this, not because of blood or status, but because of who you are." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. "He was kind to me," she whispered. "Kinder than anyone else ever was. I never expected this." The lawyer gave a small, knowing smile. "That is exactly why he chose you." Her chest tightened again, but this time with warmth. She remembered Edward's gentle words, his laughter, the quiet afternoons when he would sit and listen to her speak, never treating her as less, never judging her for her simplicity. He had once told her, "Kindness is a rare treasure, Eleanor. Those who show it deserve more than gold." Now she understood. This inheritance was not just wealth. It was his way of honoring her, of telling the world what he had seen in her when no one else would. Eleanor stood slowly, her hands trembling just a little as she gathered her bag. She did not move with arrogance, nor did she rush as though eager to claim her prize. Instead, she moved quietly, her steps measured, her head bowed slightly. Her triumph was not in riches, it was in dignity. It was in the fact that she had endured every insult without lowering herself, and in the end, truth had lifted her higher than their cruelty ever could. As she walked toward the door, she passed the same family members who only minutes ago had laughed at her. Some still lingered in the hallway, their eyes filled with bitterness and envy. They glared at her, their lips curled in disgust, but Eleanor did not return their looks. She did not need to. Her silence was enough. Her presence alone was enough. They had once laughed at her silence, but now it was that same silence that made them shift uncomfortably. She did not throw their cruelty back at them, nor did she gloat in her victory. She simply walked past, calm and steady, her quiet triumph shining brighter than any word she could say. Outside, the cool night air touched her face. She looked up at the sky where the stars had begun to appear one by one. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not by the family who had mocked her, but by the one who had mattered most. She whispered softly into the night, "Thank you, Edward." The weight of the inheritance was heavy, but she carried it with grace. She knew it would change her life, yes, but more than that, it had already changed her heart. It was not about money. It was about being recognized, about having her worth acknowledged in a world that had so often tried to tell her she was nothing. Her quiet triumph was not for the world to cheer. It was not the kind of victory that filled newspapers or made crowds applaud. It was deeper, more personal. It was the victory of dignity over cruelty, of kindness over greed, of silence over noise. As she walked away from the lawyer's office, her footsteps soft on the pavement, she did not think of riches or power. She thought only of the lesson she would carry with her forever. True wealth is not measured in gold or land, but in the way you hold yourself when the world tries to break you. And though the night was dark, Eleanor's quiet triumph lit her path brighter than any flame. The night air was cool as Eleanor walked away from the lawyer's office. The streets were quiet, the world outside unaware of the storm that had just shaken that old wooden room. Behind her, the echoes of angry voices still lingered in the hallways, but she did not turn back. She kept moving forward, each step steady, each breath calmer than the last. She had not spoken a single word to defend herself inside that room, yet in the end, she had been the one lifted highest. Not by her own hand, not by her own demands, but by the truth Edward Langley had left behind in his will. The man who had once looked past the world's judgments had seen her worth, and in his final act he had made sure everyone else would see it too. For the family, the lesson was bitter. They had mocked her, humiliated her, treated her as though she was invisible. They had mistaken her quietness for weakness, her simplicity for unworthiness. And yet, when the papers were read, when the truth was revealed, it was their arrogance that was exposed, their greed that was laid bare for all to see. In their anger, they shouted, they threatened, they cursed her name, but none of it could change the truth. None of it could erase the fact that the man they thought would reward them had instead chosen the woman they had rejected. Their shame was written not on paper, but in the silence that followed when they realized how wrong they had been. Eleanor's victory was not loud. She did not boast, she did not gloat, she did not throw their cruelty back in their faces. Her triumph was quiet, gentle, and full of dignity. She walked with her head held high, not because she was now wealthy, but because she had carried herself with grace in the face of humiliation. That was the true inheritance she valued most, the strength to remain herself when the world tried to make her feel small. Days later, when word spread about the will, the story shocked many. People whispered about it in shops, in markets, in the neighborhood streets. Did you hear? The simple woman they all mocked. She was the one who inherited everything. Some spoke with disbelief, others with admiration, but all of them repeated the same lesson. Never judge a person by their appearance, their silence, or their simplicity. Eleanor did not chase attention. She did not wave her inheritance like a banner. Instead, she lived quietly, just as she always had, though now with the means to live comfortably. She used what she had been given wisely, not wasting it on arrogance, but turning it into something meaningful. In her heart, she carried Edward's words, and with every decision she made, she honored the kindness he had shown her. For those who had mocked her, life did not offer the same peace. Greed had eaten at them for too long, and their envy only grew when they saw her walking with calmness, unbothered by their bitterness. They had wanted wealth to prove their worth. She had received wealth because her worth was already clear to the one who mattered. The lesson hung heavy in their hearts, whether they admitted it or not. Respect cannot be demanded through bloodlines, arrogance, or wealth. True respect is earned through character, through kindness, through quiet strength. Eleanor's life became the living proof of that truth. Whenever people spoke of her story, they remembered not the anger of the family, not the chaos of the will reading, but the way she had sat silently, endured cruelty, and walked out with her dignity untouched. In the end, the inheritance was more than money or property. It was a message, a reminder from Edward Langley to all who remained, that worth is not measured by greed, that love and loyalty outshine titles, and that sometimes the one everyone underestimates is the one who holds the greatest strength. As Eleanor sat by her window one evening, the city lights glowing in the distance, she thought of Edward again. She whispered softly, "I will carry your gift with honor." She knew her life would never be the same, but she also knew she would never let the inheritance change the heart he had trusted. And so the lesson lived on. In every whisper of her story, in every retelling of that shocking will reading, people learned that appearances deceive, arrogance destroys, and dignity endures. The family who had mocked her would be remembered for their anger, but Eleanor Hayes would be remembered for her quiet triumph, a triumph so powerful it needed no words.